Flies. I heard this story from the very participant in the events, a former university teacher who later became a homeless tramp. Probably some misfortune had befallen him in his life, and now he was lying in the hospital on the verge of death. And here's what he told me. The weather was disgusting, a typical English summer. All day long the rain pounded dejectedly on the roofs and dripped in murmuring streams onto the pavements of the city through innumerable drainpipes. The dome of St. Paul's Cathedral was enveloped in a huge cloud. The sky was gloomy and did not bode well for the next few hours. When dusk fell, the rain did stop for a while, and I was able to leave my shelter under the old archway, hoping to find a more pleasant place to spend the night. It was not cold, on the contrary. The air hovered as in the tropics, the stuffiness oppressed and grew more and more, but for some reason the refreshing thunderstorm lingered. I was so hungry that my eyes grew dark, I felt sick, and I almost lost consciousness. I imagined a clean bed. And I stupidly wandered in search of some room for a relatively affordable fee. And so, when my legs themselves carried me to the Holborn area, I first saw this house. If I had been run over by some random truck then, I would not have had to go through such a horror, and I did not tell would you now the entire this nightmare. The house was small but very old. The area is full of such Elizabethan monuments. It seemed as if its beautiful high windows were grinning at my poverty and throwing a brazen challenge in my face. Above the entrance, I saw a sign with words that gave me a lot of hope: the house is for rent. The time was already late, the streets were empty, and my head was buzzing with tension and fatigue, like the sky that had not been discharged by the long-awaited thunderstorm. And suddenly, as if whipping me in my indecision, a huge drop fell right on my forehead. The drop was sticky and warm, like the night itself, and all doubts immediately dissipated. Inside this self-confident and arrogant house, no doubt, shelter awaited me from the coming storm. I cautiously approached the door. Naturally, she was locked up. Just in case, I checked the windows on the first floor and cursed. As always, I was fatally unlucky. But then I noticed that one window was not quite tightly closed. Apparently, the bolts were loosened. I looked around. The policeman who was on duty at the corner just turned his back on me. Two couples hurried past. There are no witnesses. The rest was a matter of 1 minute. The sound of glass, the turn of the handle, and the window is open. Open, and seductively beckoning inside. With the last of my strength, I climbed onto the windowsill and, after a few seconds, rather awkwardly plopping down on the floor, everything found himself in the promised place. I don't know how long I lay on the floor, trying to catch my breath. My heart was beating wildly, my temples were pounding. Maybe an hour and a half, or maybe just a few minutes. I must have lost my mind. Still would. I haven't had a crumb in my mouth for 3 days. But finally, I got up, closed the window so as not to arouse suspicion, and examined my pockets in search of a match that was lying around. When the match was lit, I almost dropped it at the sight of the spectacle. The room was furnished with expensive antique furniture in the style of the 17th century. On a large marble fireplace stood a silver candlestick holding 7 candles, and I immediately lit them to get a better look. At first I thought that I was hallucinating from hunger. But no, it was all real. And I, an unfortunate homeless tramp, found shelter in a place that no words can describe. It was a true antique's paradise. With a candlestick in my hand, I went to the door of the room and lingered a little at the threshold. I suddenly felt uncomfortable. From the outside, the house looked empty and abandoned, as evidenced by the surrender sign. Inside, There was luxurious furniture, and everything said that people live here. Am I wrong? I could well have ended up in the wrong place, given my deplorable state at the time. If the owners find me, I'm not good. As far as I remembered, the policeman was standing very close, and if they take me to the station, then all my excuses will seem unconvincing. From the point of view of the owner of the house, I was a real burglar. Jail. Yes, it provided some sort of refuge, but my natural pride always compelled me to forego the benefits of imprisonment. However, what pride can I have? I only smiled at the thought of her, remembering my unenviable position. And that's when I first heard this terrible sound. At first I thought that the noise, or rather, some kind of incomprehensible buzz, was born in my head, and prepared for new surprises that my extremely exhausted organism could present me. The hum grew and then almost stopped, but not quite, as if some invisible plane was circling high above the house. I stopped and shook my head to get rid of that annoying tinnitus. But no, the buzzing did not stop, and it was as if I had stuck my head in a beehive. As soon as this comparison came to my mind, I noticed that the room became warmer. Swaying, I reached forward and pushed open the heavy door. It opened, and in a second I found myself in a spacious hall. And at that moment, the humming stopped. By the candlelight, I noticed a small door leading, apparently, to the kitchen, and immediately, with a shaky gait, went there. There will surely be something to eat. I walked slowly, fearing that the creaky oak floorboards would give me away to the owners. Opening this small door very carefully, I saw that it led to the hallway, and from there you can get into the kitchen. I lifted the candlestick over my head and looked around carefully. To my right was another door, probably to the bedroom. Then I looked to my left and almost screamed with joy. On the small kitchen table was laid out food that I could not even dream of. Putting the candlestick on the floor, I immediately pounced on it and began to greedily eat literally everything that came my way. All principles of high morality disappeared in the blink of an eye. After all, I am a human being, a living being, and have not eaten for several days. Who dares to reproach me for the fact that I could not refuse my exhausted body and was unable to endure attacks of hellish pain in my stomach? Then I heard that unpleasant, oppressive sound again, a low, drawn-out hum. But now I already knew for sure that this was not the fruit of hungry hallucinations. My head had already cleared up. I lowered my glass, which I had just filled with some sweet wine, and listened. Sounds like the noise was coming from the bedroom. I drank some wine, went to the door and put my ear to the keyhole. Zzz. Yes, there was no mistake, the sound came from there. Then I decided to see what was happening there, but I didn't see anything through the keyhole, it was too dark in the room. And suddenly a strange desire took possession of me. I wanted to find out by all means where this hum comes from and, at the risk of waking the tenants, nevertheless ventured to carefully turn the door handle. The buzzing stopped almost immediately. Slowly, very slowly, I opened the door and looked inside. And my heart sank with fear. In the middle of the room, a coffin stood on two chairs, and on the floor next to it were two candlesticks with short butts sticking out. In the corner, I noticed a large four-poster bed, on which clothes were scattered in disorder. Next to the bed lay the lid of the coffin. At first, in the dim light of the candles, it seemed to me that a Negro was lying in the coffin. I moved closer, and as I got closer, the hum began to get louder. And suddenly, as if a veil lifted from the corpse, exposing what was left on his gnawed, festering face, which appeared before my frightened gaze. Almost suffocating from the infernal stench, I recoiled and closed my eyes so as not to look at this mutilated naked creature. The horrid smell of rot made his throat rise in a wave of nausea. Trying not to breathe, so as not to feel this wild stench, I stepped back, but something got under my feet. I stumbled, hit the door with his back, and it slammed shut. A second later, I was fighting off thousands of flies that had flown off the corpse and were now attacking me furiously, avenging me for interfering with their feast. I frantically waved my hands, though without much success. It seemed to me that this whole room came to life and turned into millions of tiny sticky hairy paws, grabbing me from all sides. And this nightmarish roar did not stop for a second, the sound of wings beating in the fetid air. One fly, larger than all the others, landed on my upper lip and tried to push its fat body into my mouth. I thought of the corpse she had just fed on, and I felt sick. I hit my lips with force, crushed this fat fly with a squelching sound, and heard how it thudded heavily to the floor. Somehow I managed to get to the hallway door and open it. While fighting off the flies, I had lost my candlestick and now groped my way into the living room, constantly stumbling and gasping with horror. The bedroom door slammed behind me and I thanked God for my salvation. There was something very strange about the behavior of these winged demons, as if they had a single mind, acted together and attacked me in a certain pattern, as if their movement was led by one higher leader or common mind. Left in the dark, I began to search at random for the door leading to the hall. And finally fingers found the handle. I turned it sharply, then again and again, but the door did not open, the lock slipped, and a terrible thought pierced my brain. Having slammed all the doors with spring locks, I imprisoned myself in this devilish house. Distraught with terror, I began to pound on the door with all my might. Again and again I leaned with my whole body against this insurmountable oak barrier, wasting my newly restored strength on useless, desperate attempts to get out of the hallway. And almost lost hope, when he suddenly remembered the kitchen. Idiot! I swore loudly and stumbled through the darkness to another door. Here, only here, deliverance awaits me. I turned and shook my fist at those nasty buzzing creatures locked in the bedroom behind the terrible door. They wanted to get my body, to drink warm blood and torment living flesh. I felt it, I knew it already then, in the room, when I fought them off. But I will deceive them. Laughing triumphantly, I rushed into the kitchen, hoping to get out through the back door. To my right was a large window through which moonlight entered the room. I tried to turn the latch on the back door and, oh Virgin Mary, she succumbed. But then my laughter died down. The damned door didn't move through any. I pushed her and pulled her towards me, but it was all in vain. It wasn't until I took a closer look at the door that I realized what was going on. Acute, the tips of the nails stuck out at regular intervals around its perimeter. My only way out was nailed on the outside with large nails. But why? Suddenly, a bell rang out in the street. I looked out the window. How strange these familiar places look at night. Before me was some completely unknown part of the city. The neighboring houses were so close that it seemed that you could reach them with your hand. I noticed that they were all very unusually painted, and the roofs converged so close that there was hardly room for light, only narrow strips of sky between the houses. The ringing of the bell was getting closer. Now it was heard quite close by, and through it I discerned the sound of wheels on the cobblestone pavement. Another monotonous voice was heard, but I still could not make out the words. What merchant could come here with his wagon at such a time? But whoever he was, I could hope to get help from him. I just had to somehow attract his attention to myself. I climbed onto the table near the window and looked down. The house stood on a slope, and it was impossible to jump from here, this window was too high. Finally, a wagon appeared in the street, drawn by a dejected black horse, led by a gloomy man by the bridle. In his hand he held a bell and shouted something. Another person was sitting on the wagon, and both of them had such mournful faces, as if something very serious had happened. I saw an old lantern on the table and, finding a match, lit it, brought it to the window and began to slowly swing it from side to side. Soon they will notice me, stop and help me get out of this damned house. Here you go. He notices me and waves his hand. But why does he keep shouting with such strange insistence? I smiled and nodded, beckoning him to come closer. And then his words reached my ears. Am I out of my mind? I didn't know anything about that corpse in the next room before. So why did he meaningfully point his finger at me on the porch and again shouted, "Take out the corpses," and then he pointed to a cart loaded with, "What did you think?" I shuddered when I saw that people were piled into one incredible terrible pile in the cart, and when the moonlight fell on it, I noticed that some of them were still alive. Still not understanding what was happening, I looked at the houses opposite and screamed desperately. On each door was drawn in chalk a large, fat cross, the sign of death, the sign of hopelessness, a sign understandable all over the world, the cross of the plague. The wagon rolled on, and I stood, as if struck by thunder, and could not move. I was stunned. Really, having got in this house, I failed 3 centuries ago. Maybe I already died in that ill-fated arch, and all this is my own hell. I clasped my head in my hands and at that moment again heard an ominous buzzing above me. Trembling with fear, I tiptoed to the door, holding my lantern high above my head. The rumble intensified so much that it could no longer be compared even with a swarm of bees. The flies went berserk because their prey resisted them. But live prey, probably, was much more pleasant for them than a corpse. There was a terrible stuffiness in the house, and I was very thirsty. I thought about food and wine, but as soon as I looked at the table, I immediately recoiled in disgust. Could it be that just a few minutes ago I could have eaten this food, which was full of fat white worms and fly eggs? Or did it all fade away during the time I was away? And suddenly I heard a loud victorious buzzing above my head, turned my head and froze, unable to move. A huge fat fly the size of a walnut majestically landed on a piece of rotten meat. She didn't move, but there was something provocative and sinister about her posture. A second later, 2 more of the same kind joined her, and now the buzzing was heard even in the living room. I looked at the bedroom door and a scream of horror escaped my chest. Insects crawled from under the door in a continuous stream. The size of a large cherry, no less. Stopping for a moment at the gap, they spread their wings and flew up to the table. There they took up a fighting position, lined up in even rows behind their 3 leaders. An infernal hum filled the entire room. The flies were jubilant. With diabolical method they prepared for the final attack. They managed to outwit me, and now they were just waiting for the signal to attack. And I stood paralyzed, watching as they continued to line up their ranks. For a few seconds they sat motionless on the table and waited for the last soldiers of this insane army to take their places. And then, as one being, they rose into the air at once, and everything around hummed from the movement of millions of their wings. And this rumble, a hymn of death, resounded throughout the house. With a wild cry, I ran out into the kitchen, dropping the lantern along the way, and thousands of parasites roared around me with a roar of whirlwinds, landing on my face, neck, clogging my ears and mouth. I could not see anything and, blindly fighting them off, I forcibly climbed onto the table by the window. It was at least 16 feet from the ground, but I didn't hesitate for a second. There is a plague in the house, the flies carry it on themselves, which means that all the food was also contaminated. As soon as I remembered the food, I felt a desperate attack of nausea. Finally losing my head, I swung and dropped the glass with my fist. And although my fate was already sealed, I decided fool these creatures. Let them eat my corpse better, but never a living body. Take out the corpses. I screamed in hysterics. And then he closed his eyes and stepped into the void. At this, the tramp fell silent, and I already learned the end of the story from his doctor, whom I met on the street, leaving the hospital. He was picked up in one of the lanes in Holborn. Accident. Truck ran over him. Legs. Poor fellow, he was almost starving to death and naturally delirious. And since then, I cannot make him forget all this nonsense that he told you today. All evening I thought about what I heard. Is this story true or is it a delusion of the patient? Having not found an answer, I went to Holborn, but could not find the house mentioned in the vagrant's story. The ambulance driver showed me the place where the unfortunate man was picked up. For a long time I made inquiries and found out that the road passes here over the burial place of the victims of the great epidemic of the Black Plague.